for the study of cities, and given the themes this year, it relates very much to resilience and climate change and other big subjects. But when we started the competition, started talking about the competition a half dozen years ago, there was a sense that maybe there wasn't much of a future for urban studies, and it's been a really affirming experience all along, because every year we've had fantastic contributions, and in a moment I'm going to turn the floor over to Rebecca Carter, who's going to tell you more about this year's competition. But I think what's clear, and you'll see in a moment, that there's a lot of really insightful work that's being done, and it's good to be able to present it. I just want to, on behalf of the Wilson Center and Allison Garland and Thea Cook, thank our colleagues from the World Bank and the International Housing Coalition, Bob Dubinsky sitting next to me, Cities Alliance, and of course AID for cooperating every year on this wonderful competition. And I think at that, I'll just turn the floor over to Rebecca. But this is really an honor for us to be involved in this program.
All right, thank you very much, Blair, and thanks to the rest of you hardy souls for making it in today. I expect we'll have some more people trickling in as we go on. I do want to start off by thanking the Wilson Center for hosting this competition every year. This is the 5th competition, so we are building quite a great track record, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. I'd like to thank Allison Garland, who I think does a lot of the heavy lifting on actually making this competition come together, as well as Blair. I'd also like to thank our colleagues at the International Housing Coalition, the Cities Alliance, and the World Bank. Thanks are also due in advance to our discussants today, and they are Victor Vergara, who is a lead urban specialist in social, urban, rural, and resilience at the World Bank, Jeff Suchman, acting deputy director in the Office of Policy, Bureau for Policy, Planning and Learning at USAID, and Jacob Reisner, program manager at the International Youth Foundation. And perhaps most importantly, I'd like to thank and congratulate the winners of this year's competition. And they are Eric Chu, who is a PhD candidate at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Clifford Amawako, who is a PhD candidate at the Social and Political Sciences Graduate Research Program in the Faculty of Arts at Monash University in Australia, and Sina Jung Sorensen, MPA in International Development, London School of Economics and Political Science, and also Overseas Development Institute Fellow in Madagascar. These students are joining a growing roster of urban research professionals whose early career research has been supported by the Reducing Urban Poverty paper competition for advanced graduate students. I want to direct your attention to the flyers that I know some of you picked up on the way in, which offer a retrospective on who the previous winners were and what they have gone on to do in their careers so far. And I think it's worth taking just a minute to, point out some of the accomplishments that this group has already achieved since they've been in the competition. You'll see that several of them have continued in academia, either continuing graduate studies, becoming postdocs, I think in some cases even professors. One runs a research group at MIT that's focused on urban food security called City Farm, which was featured in Wired magazine in September. And another runs a business startup incubator in Myanmar that has so far supported 13 new entrepreneurs. And the range of topics they are working on is as impressive as it is diverse, ranging from tsunami recovery, bioenergy, environmental governance, urban migration, social inclusion, security, poverty alleviation, access to basic services, and a host of others. The alumni of this program are truly an impressive group, and it's very gratifying to see them moving on to positions where they are indeed contributing to reducing urban poverty, and to know that this paper competition played a role in providing encouragement and support to them along the way. The students you see before you have an additional reason to be proud to have been selected as winners of this year's competition, because each year word of the competition grows and the competition gets fiercer. So this year, for example, we received 146 abstract submissions from 29 countries. From those, 23 were invited to submit full papers, and 8 of those papers were selected for publication. So publication in the books that several of you picked up on the way in. The students you see before you are the top 3 from that quite large and diverse group. And the grand prize winner, Eric Chu, also has already presented his paper in November 2014 at the 15th NARIS conference in Brussels at the invitation of the Cities Alliance. I sincerely congratulate you on your accomplishment and look forward to hearing more about your research. And with that, let's get started.
Just in terms of format, what we'll do is we'll have presentations and discussion, and then if there are specific points of clarification, we can raise them, but we want to try to keep the discussion until at the end. So, Eric, you're first up.
All right. Should I stand? Because I can't see half the room. I will stand. All right. Thank you, everybody. It's really an honor to be here. I'm Eric Chu. I am a last semester, thank you, PhD student at MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning. The paper, the chapter, is really based on some exploratory work for my dissertation that I started back in late 2010 when I started at MIT. And the overriding question of my entire research project has always been, how do city governments in developing countries understand the impacts of climate change? How do they translate those mandates into what they're existingly doing? And what changes do you see in city governance, in city policymaking, and city planning in response to these emerging impacts? But also, a critical issue that I am really interested in is what are the impacts of external actors who are funding and supporting some of these adaptation efforts in city governments. The location that I talk about in this paper is India, where the bulk of my dissertation research is in. And this, in the chapter itself, in the paper, I talk about 3 cities. So it's kind of a squeeze to talk about all 3 in one setting. So I'm just going to try to run through some of these cases, but really focus on the policy implications that kind of emerge from looking at these cities and studying these cities for almost 5 years now. Here are some pictures, some of the initial impacts of extreme events that some of these cities really cite as motivations for adaptation planning. The 3 cities that I talk about are Bhubaneswar in eastern Orissa, Surat in western Gujarat, and Indore in the central state of Madhya Pradesh. And all 3 are fairly different cities in terms of what kinds of impacts will occur. Surat, for example, is really interested in protecting the city against floods, for example. The interior city of Indore is really water stressed and has issues with maintaining their water infrastructure in drought seasons, for example. But the one common thread is that all 3 cities have a long history of receiving external support. The organization that I followed most for the past 5-6 years is actually the Rockefeller Foundation. As many of you probably know, one key program in Indian cities is the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, ACER, which has concluded, but is one of the major motivators and funders of adaptation and resilience efforts in Indian cities. And a lot of cities cite either Rockefeller as the primary kind of, I don't want to use donor, but it kind of is, in supporting their resilience and adaptation programs such as Surat and Indore. And cities like Bhubaneswar, who see those pilot cities like Surat and Indore as additional motivators, as kind of policy diffusion issues where they're learning from these pilot cities, but kind of planning as they go along. So the scene, just to quickly set the scene here, this is exploratory work where I really focus on public sector institutions in these 3 cities, looking at what kinds of governance mechanisms are kind of being changed or being used really focusing on things like plan-making mechanisms, kind of inclusion mechanisms, participatory processes, budgeting mechanisms, and kind of the more kind of mundane things like physical planning, like looking at a lot of maps, looking at a lot of plan strategies and policies and white papers and all that come out. I won't kind of talk a lot about what climate adaptation is, because that's not needed. But here are the 3 cities, just to briefly kind of map those out as I was talking about them. And just really to talk about some of the findings that I kind of highlight in the chapter itself. The chapter in the discussion is divided into 3 parts, looking at motivations for adaptation planning, which is a key stream of research that our research group at MIT really kind of talks about, looking at some of those inclusive participatory processes that came out, and also looking at some of those physical concrete outcomes that came out of the planning processes. As you can see here, 3 sets of photographs from 3 cities are really kind of the outputs and outcomes of Rockefeller projects, of UNDP projects, of AID projects that have happened in some of these cities, but with local flavors, I guess. The question I asked before is, these external funds seemingly uniform in the sense that it really is just a guideline of what cities should do, what vulnerability assessments should include. So what accounts for some of these diverse outcomes at the end? Why do cities, when faced with some of this money, which they're often very eager to accept, and these kind of external actors often hiring local consultants, how do these kind of mandates and recommendations get translated into what you see on the ground today? And one of the key arguments in the paper is that, yes, there are a lot of these external motivators and incentives that come in, but when it comes down to it, it's really, cities are really translating some of these external mandates using some of the more mundane, what later gets framed, not in this paper, but later in my dissertation, gets framed as the mundane artifacts of urban governance. What you're seeing is that climate change adaptation, though there is a lot of uncertainty and kind of issues with projections and issues of sustainability of funds, are really getting integrated into city governments in a way that cities are starting to take ownership of how the message is framed. And in the paper, the frame that I focus on is the issue of co-benefits here. Obviously, cities are, a lot of times, are resource constrained to some degree. Surat, for example, is considered in the Indian context as a high capacity city. But you do see, for example, when Rockefeller came in and said, oh, well, we're going to give you some resources to do a vulnerability assessment, and the results came out and said public health is an issue because they have a history of public health issues, public health disasters, I guess, because plague, they did experience that at some point 15 years ago. And things like river flooding, those you should really just plan for. And we're going to give you some money to do some pilot projects. And what occurred was that they did come up with an early warning system. They did kind of reinforce some of those flooding infrastructures to prevent backlogs and for example, like that. But in order to gain acceptance in the city political sphere and to gain awareness with the populace, it was the adaptation framing kind of got lost. And you saw this bridging between sectors and bridging between vulnerable populations and private capitalists, in this case of Surat, as a really key driver in translating this external adaptation mandate into something that you see 5 years later on the ground. And there are pros and cons with this kind of framing, this co-beneficial framing. A very glaring one is what happens to marginalized communities at the end that the assumption is that they have a lower voice in this process. And in Sura, you do see that. You do see private industrialists and business, I mean, not necessarily kind of on purpose, but you do see them overriding the process a little bit and seeing things like water flooding infrastructure protecting the more economically valuable assets. But having said that, there is conscious effort to kind of gain civil society inclusion in some of these planning processes and in the outcomes. And these are some pictures from, the one on the right is from Indore, where I lived in a slum for about 3 months following a women's group around that have taken, not taken, I guess taken is the right word, Rockefeller seed money and really just developed a community-based water management, water management system within their neighborhood and have framed adaptation really as a response against long-term water stress. And you do see, I asked them questions like, so what do you do when there's extreme events? What do you do? And their vocabulary when talking about climate change, a lot of times because of Rockefeller influence and others, are starting to really talk about climate change a little bit. When I first started back in 2010, it was just not part of the vocabulary. And it was very difficult to ask them questions about this. But when you really observe what they're already doing autonomous responses against some of these emerging impacts because they are feeling it. What Rockefeller really added was the vocabulary of climate change and climate stress. And really kind of just like, oh my God, somehow it clicked within this particular group at least. What we're seeing in the past 10, 15 years, oh, this is climate change. And finally we have a name for it. Finally we have a source of money for it. And finally we have people who are dedicated to come in, like me, who actually go in and ask them and pester them. But also seeing other aid agencies come in and say, this is an issue, and we're gonna support kind of further projects that you're doing in this sphere. The picture on the left there is a hazard response team, a volunteer team in Bhubaneswar. Because the city does experience a lot of cyclones, this team, some of the training modules are funded by the Red Cross and also UNDP. So you're starting to see people come in and really kind of agglomerate, I guess, around issues of climate change, even though sometimes they're not framed exactly like adaptation because adaptation is so difficult to define. And the local context of how adaptation and risk reduction and vulnerability manifests very differently. So you see this variety of adaptation and vulnerability reduction in a lot of different contexts, in a lot of different ways. And it's really interesting to see how these projects come up kind of even with the same idea of adaptation and seeing the variety kind of underneath it. I guess I'll talk about the constraints a little bit later, just because I think I'm running low on time. But just kind of key issues that I've raised already is issues of participation, injustices in representation, but also in the distributional impacts of some of the adaptation, physical infrastructure, adaptation infrastructures that are being put in. Issues of mainstreaming adaptation and development, particularly in terms of financing and budgets. There is a very strong push to integrate adaptation and vulnerability issues into city budgets. And cities are finding it very difficult, I think is the right way, to understand how adaptation this broad and cross-sectoral translates into line items on a budget. But you do see cities like Surat, Indore, Bhubaneswar inserting those issues into their city budgets. And because Rockefeller money has ended, and so the push for sustaining some of these programs, for them it really needs to be internal, to have internal champions, internal institutional leaders, but also the policy instruments behind it to continue when Rockefeller and AID actually leave. So some issues. So just to kind of wrap up some of these issues very quickly, this exploratory research, the motivation behind it is really to try to understand how adaptation manifests on the ground. I've been on IPCC for a couple years now, and the one complaint that I always have is adaptation is very theoretical. It's when you talk about resilience, you draw these Venn diagrams and you draw these really complex issues. But at least at the IPCC level, we didn't spend a lot of time understanding what people were actually doing. We're always like, well, people should do this. It's climate impacts, and there's uncertainty. Well, 2 degrees, 4 degrees, but cities should transform what they're doing to account for these impacts. And for us, when I ask, what does that really mean? I don't really understand. Like, what are these pathways? What are these mechanisms for change? It's really unclear. But in the 2014 IPCC, we did have some conscious effort to try to catalog what this means. And in Chapter 14, the chapter that I am in, Adaptation Needs and Options, we started to build a table of what adaptation needs and options, what those really looked like. And so this is one motivation behind trying to empirically document what is actually happening. So Rockefeller is really interested in some of these issues because they funded a lot of these things for a long time, and they're still going to in a different kind of 100 resilient cities frame, but they really want to account for what happened. And given the experimenting and the innovations that are occurring at the ground level, how does this actually upscale and be replicated to different cities? Yeah, I'm showing all these diverse adaptation projects, but how does this kind of women's group-led water management system get transferred into a different context where there's also a women's group, but the awareness is not there, or the leadership is not there, or the initial seed money is not there? How do we actually understand the diffusion of these adaptation innovations across cities and not just the 3 that I listed here? Actually, finally the punchline, well, not one of the 3 punchlines, I guess, is so how does the transformation that the higher policy level people always ask for, how do those occur when adaptation on the ground is operationalized using some of these mundane tools of day-to-day urban governance? How do kind of incremental budget how changes in budget or incremental integration of adaptation vocabulary into their 5-year city development plans and all these little things that cities are already doing, how do you understand how socioeconomic transformation, when we're talking about climate change, really fits into this day-to-day governance and kind of day-to-day operational framework that cities are constrained to follow, because they do have a legislative mandate of providing services and infrastructure, and they do have budget cycles, they do have electoral cycles where climate change doesn't fit in. So this builds towards maybe some more publications in the future, and trying to understand and trying to answer some of those questions that I raised. But yeah, so I think that's it for me. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Victor?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. You did a great job. It's on.
Yeah.
And thanks, first of all, to the Wilson Center. Allison has done a great job. Incredibly hardworking, very intelligent person, keeping us in the other partner institutions working together. So acknowledging her and the Wilson Center. I was part of the jury. I read all those abstracts and papers that were mentioned. And it is very motivating to have such a large group of very talented students that are thinking about very difficult issues. On Eric's paper, I'd like to focus on a couple of issues. Starting, I think, with with the complexity of defining adaptation in the context of the reality of the cities where he was and where most of the world is, which are informal cities, cities that are growing through slums, cities that, as he pointed out, have very fragile institutions and weak finances. But that's the setting. Now, the setting, and I think the takeaway from Eric's paper in the last page, which I think is very powerful, is the point that there is and there needs to be parallel drawn with adaptation and just good urban development. What Eric calls mundane is not mundane.
No.
What Eric calls mundane is not, it is what is not being done. The day-to-day in the developing country cities is not being done day-to-day. And that's why these cities are so incomplete. Cities without sewerage networks, cities without transport networks, cities without land use planning, they are indeed incomplete cities. And and I think that the point that Eric makes about having this incremental change, how can they see it, is very difficult when, in fact, they're not able to meet the day-to-day obligations that they have. I'd like to also mention a little bit about Eric's point on motivation and the role of external actors, which I think I'm an external actor, so I can talk badly about myself without hurting anybody. There are a couple of dimensions to this that I think are very real. Perhaps some of them were more relevant some years ago. But there was, I think, and there still is, a perception of being relevant, of what Eric said. You know, Rockefeller wants to see how he spent his money. What was the impact? It's a reasonable proposition. But more than that, I think it's the trap that we as external actors have fallen in trying to see that that the work that we do with our clients is incremental. And for many years in the World Bank, that was a very kind of a sacred mantra, you know. And the Mexican government, when we negotiated loans, they were very happy to sort of insult the bank by saying, you know, what you're financing is not incremental. We're just taking your money and we're doing what we would do anyway. And that is something that we need to be comfortable with. There's a bit of an incremental dilemma. Are we in fact changing the behavior of someone? Do we need to change the behavior of someone, or are they simply going to recognize that they need to do some things better? And what they need to do better is basically to build better cities. Build better cities and to do the day-to-day. And I think that is, it's a big tension. Everyone wants to be seen as relevant. Everyone wants to be seen as the product of change, and we're not. You know, it's a very complicated ecosystem of institutions, external and internal, and in the end, we have to be happy knowing that we are contributing to a very messy ecosystem of institutions, and that we're moving, and we're not preventing good things from happening. The point about incremental and about being relevant, I think it always comes down to, I guess, the kiss of death of feeling not relevant is the budget. When you say you need a climate adaptation budget, you need a gender budget, and you need a mosquito budget, and you need everything budget, and in the end, the city that is trying to reconcile many needs, some of them life and death, are pushed to make decisions that are not, in fact, relevant to the needs of the city. And I think that's a part of Eric's paper that I like very much. When you mentioned, you know, that there's not, are they really looking out for the welfare of the individuals, or is it just a growth strategy at the expense of welfare? Which is a very important question. Now, it's a difficult question, but that's the conversation that needs to be had in order to put things into perspective. when I was working in Manila after typhoon, we were doing the post-disaster needs assessment, and there was a discussion, very brutal and hard discussion about standards of reconstruction and about priorities. The Pasig River in Manila is dead, and to clean it up, it would take an incredible effort. Some of it is ongoing. And the question that one has to ask oneself, which is a hard and vulgar question, but it's real, is does it really matter if someone dies drowning in dirty water rather than clean water? You have an agenda of institutions that are pushing, in this case, clean water at the expense of the welfare question is saving individuals. Does it make sense? And that's a question of budget allocation. So I think as soon as you get into the partitioning the budget, you get into, I think, a very tricky situation, because you are, in fact, distorting the discussion of what is important to the individuals. Finally, I'd like to end and bring to parallel the discussion that Eric makes in his last paragraph when he talks about, quote, so in terms of wider policy contribution, this paper argues that external agents should approach urban adaptation and urban development as mutually reinforcing objectives, rather than dedicating adaptation funds that are operationally distinct from traditional development assistance. I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, that is the bottom line. As soon as you start taking parts of a development agenda, you create a development Frankenstein. You don't create a city. And you need to have a consistent framework of how do you build a better city for everybody. Big, difficult question. But I think that's the relevant question, rather than saying, how are we going to adapt? Do you really want to adapt a city that is 50% slums and people are living in misery? Or do you want to fix the city? That, I think, is the question that Eric asked, and I think it's a very relevant question in the context of the competition. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Let me just ask if there are any points of clarification, very specific points from the presentations. If not, we'll move on and we'll save time for discussion. Okay, why don't we move on, and we'll hear next from Clifford.
This up here.
Thank you.
I just move.
Yeah,
I will move.
yeah, you can sit. Thank you very much. My name is Clifford Amuakon from Ghana. Thank you very much for bringing me here to discuss with you the politics of flood vulnerability in informal settlements in Accra, Ghana. Okay, great. So in the next 15 minutes, I will be talking to you about flood vulnerability and how it has been conceptualized in African cities. I will talk about flooding and urban informality in African cities and how it has been discussed. Then I will talk about Accra, the study area, Agboboloshi, and Old Fadama, my main informal settlement. And then I'll talk about flood vulnerability and politics of eviction. Then I'll do some reflections as to how I think we can begin to think about flood vulnerability. Flood vulnerability in African cities have been discussed variously. However, two key issues have come up, and they are that flood vulnerability is looked at from a geophysical point of view, in which discussions have concentrated on climate change, amount of rainfall, and so on. When that happens, people affected in informal settlements are seen as passive victims, people who find themselves at areas where they are helpless and affected by something they have no control over. On the other hand, it has also been discussed as people moving to hazardous areas and therefore being vulnerable to flooding, meaning they are the cause of their own problems. With these two views, two major interventions have come up. The first is when it is seen as, or when flood victims are seen as passive and therefore have no control over what happens to them. Usually, the intervention has been distribution of relief items, such as beddings, mattresses, and so on, food, and so on. On the other hand, when they are seen as the cause of the problem, the interventions have generally been forced evictions by the governments or the city governments. I find these two approaches too simplistic and not good enough to solve the problem. As a result, over the past 2 decades or more, so many African cities have had flooding of various forms. Millions of people have been displaced. Thousands have lost their jobs and livelihoods, and a few hundreds have lost their lives. So the question is, how then do we understand flooding and informality and therefore be able to tackle it? I believe we can understand it by understanding how African cities have been conceptualized and how they have been shaped. I think that 3 major important processes are going on in every African city. The first is informality. The second is urban governance. And the third is urban vulnerability. Talking about informality, informality takes various forms. It takes the form of growth outside planning, growth at the blind side of city governance. Several factors cause these growths, but I want to mention about 4 of them. The first is that in most African cities, there are plural land ownership and administrative systems, where we have the state planning system running parallel to an informal land administration, which is customary in nature and accepted as part of the urban system. Usually lands, or a bigger proportion of the land, belongs to the second type, which is the customary land administration. And it has been difficult for city governments to deal with that. The other point about informality is the fact that development has always been ahead of planning. In most cities in Africa, before formal planning was introduced, the cities were growing already. So certain things have been going on before planning came in, and they don't change very much. Aside these two are the commonly known migration from rural areas to urban areas, and general failure of urban development to deal with housing, to deal with poverty, to deal with marginalization. So these are some of the things we're looking at when we talk about informality. But deep down in there is a process of dwelling, where the migrant into the city learns to live in the city. So everyday life is housing. Everyday life is living. And what you see physically, as you are seeing here, is just a physical manifestation of a living process. And that is important to note as part of the way African cities are shaped. Vulnerability can also be looked at resulting as a result of that process I just discussed, the process of living and facing everyday life, no matter how harsh it comes. So vulnerability in an urban area, a typical African urban city, has to do with living conditions, has to do with dealing with hazards or yearly hazards or everyday hazards, and also has to deal with lack of access to basic infrastructure, basic housing, and so on. In the face of all this is city governance. City governance in Africa has had or has been dealing with all kinds of things. I've discussed these two of them. So what you see is that there is a presence and an absence. Presence of, or let me start with an absence, then a presence. So the city is absent, or the city governance or government is absent when the first migrant comes in. He is not seen, he is not noticed, she is not known, she is not recorded. And then he stays, he learns to stay, and is within. Then all of a sudden, city governance appears brutally to say, you don't belong here, go back to where you came from. So what you see is an absence and a presence. Now, this is how I think we can understand the cities of Africa, and therefore understand vulnerability in that context. Now I look at my study context. Study is in Accra, Ghana. Accra is the capital of Ghana. I call it a colonial city. It became the capital of Ghana in 1877 when it was declared, Ghana was declared a colony of the British. From there, it has grown from around 190,000 people at independence in 1957 to about 3.5 million people now. Now, at the center of Accra, you see this river called Odo River, and it leads into a lagoon called Korle Lagoon. The city authorities estimate that about 52% of the population live within the catchment of these two water bodies, that is the river and the lagoon, which leads into the Gulf of Guinea. Now, because about 52% of people live within the catchment of this stream or these water bodies, it is very important because it is passing through the most urbanized part of the city. Two settlements are very interesting within the catchment, and that happens to be the two study areas that I'm talking about. That is Agbogbloshie. Don't try to mention it at Old Fadama. Agbogbloshie is a Ga community. When I say a Ga community, Ga simply means the name, or is a name given to indigenous people from Accra, Ghana. It's a Ga community which dates back to 1930s. During the colonial days, it developed as a native town, but we'll talk about that as we move on. On the other hand, Old Fadama is a squatter settlement located on an unused state land which was acquired somewhere in the 1960s but was not used. Why are these two settlements very important? They are important because, one, about 15% of all e-waste of various kinds, used refrigerators, used computers, mobile phones, etc., find themselves there. 15% that goes to Africa find themselves in that area. So for now, Agbogbloshie and Old Fadama, the two of them have the biggest e-waste hub in Africa. For fabrication, the young children between the ages of 9 and 18 change or fabricate all these refrigerators, computers, etc., which have been sent there into various cooking utensils, industrial materials, and so on. So that is the kind of job they do. And these two are located very close to the river and the lagoon. So this is Agbogbloshie, this is Old Fadama. In Ghana, Old Fadama is called Sodom and Gomorrah to represent the biblical story of a doomed city or a doomed place. And I'll talk about that as we move on. How did these two settlements grow to become what they are and therefore flood vulnerable? The story is that the first European settlers, merchants, and the British colonial government settled somewhere here and made it the central part of its governance system. So the government or the British colonial government settled somewhere there. And that is what is called, for now it is called the ministries. That is where governments have stayed and so on. Just adjacent the area was this settlement, which was then called the native town. There are two stories about how the native town developed. One is that the indigenous Gans resisted planning or resisted British planning because of the spiritual importance they attached to the river. The other is that it was intentionally neglected by city planning because it was already in a mess. So these are the two stories, reflecting the presence and absence of the state at the time. This continued until somewhere around the 1950s or late 1950s when the country got independence. After independence, the new independent government acquired this area to develop it or develop this area into a tourist attraction, which they call the Korle Lagoon Development Project. But the new government was overthrown in 1966, and therefore the project was abandoned. Nothing happened in the area there, reflecting the absence of the state again. In the early 80s, our Ghanaians in Nigeria and so on were deported. So the first people who came from Nigeria were settled there, to be screened and then be taken back to wherever they came from. So that was the first time people settled there. After that, around the early 90s, there was the Non-Aligned Movement Conference in Ghana. And as part of the state's policy to clear off the streets to hide this bad scene from visitors of the city, they relocated all street hawkers to the area, showing a kind of presence again. Several other decisions of this nature were taken to get this area populated until the early 2000s, when there was a change in government. In 2000, they changed the name of the Ministry of Tourism to Ministry of Tourism and modernization of the capital city. Immediately, the minister declared war on the people here and said, you cannot be here. So this is how the politics of land has gone on in the area. Whilst that is going on, during rainy seasons in May, June, July, this lagoon overflows and bounces back into the community. So this whole area is flooded. Now, floods of this nature results in two things. The first is a quick proposal for eviction of the people in the area. That normally attracts a lot of criticisms and pressure from international organizations. So the state will recoil, and then there will be distribution of relief items. That is what has been going on for some time now. So I will talk briefly about the politics of forced eviction. So flood vulnerability and forced eviction has been going on. So this is a picture of the area I'm talking about. This is a bit old, but this whole area is now filled up, and that is the stream, and this is the ocean. So this whole area is now used up. The residents use sawdust and other materials to fill in here and then build using wooden materials, roofing sheets and so on, and they are there. So basically this is how the place looks like. Right, how have these been produced? That is flood vulnerability and the politics been produced. They have been produced from three major viewpoints. The first is that flood vulnerability has now been associated with the informal urbanization within that flood zone, sometimes with government view, sometimes without government. And then there's some kind of pollution from the e-waste and other materials into the lagoon, and perennial flood resulting from the yearly rainfall regimes that occur in Accra. Then I will also want to mention the presence and absence of the state during these periods of flooding. The presence is where they now persuade flood victims to move or be ejected from the area. There are always threats of forced eviction, threats of demolition, and so on. An example is in 2002, there was an eviction notice served the people in Old Fadama, and they came together to place an injunction at the High Court in Accra. They lost the case, but that showed some kind of mobilization, and it has continued. That type of mobilization, or community-level mobilization, has continued, and they have been able to survive forced eviction and demolition till this time. But they have not been able to overcome flood vulnerability because it floods every year. So that's that. But aside the every year flooding, it's an emerging response that shows that flood victims are learning. Flood victims are beginning to distrust the city authorities and therefore are finding ways of dealing with their flood situation. And this is how it happens. I've talked about self-mobilization and self-organization to engage the cities. There is also a kind of translocal or international collaboration with institutions such as SDI, SLAM, and SLAM Development Institutes or agencies. They have been dealing with the UN, Habitat, and so on. there is also a kind of household level learning where you see a gradual change or alteration made to the structure in which they live. So sometimes you see structures changing from being wooden structures to concrete structures and so on. So you see that part of learning and changing and living all as a process within that, the area. In terms of the politics of forced eviction, there are 4 key actors now. There is the state, which I've told you about. They have been present when they want to be brutal or distribute relief items, and then absent when it comes to providing housing, providing infrastructure, and so on. Then there is the local media, also divided into 2 groups. There is the part that believe that that place is so bad and therefore these people don't have to be there. They should be moved. And then there is the other part which is looking at the humanitarian approach to dealing with flooding. So there's always a discussion going on as to what should be done. Then the slum dwellers themselves, with the support of NGOs, with the support of international institutions, are beginning to build what we call translocal learning arrangements, learning experiences, and so on, where, in fact, an example is when in 2003, 2004, a number of the slum community, the residents of Old Fadama were sent to Kenya, which has one of the biggest slums in Africa, to learn from other slum dwellers to know how to mobilize and deal with some of these challenges that they face. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there is still a traditional land ownership system. So, and these are the traditional Ga people, the people who have the land, who believe that land belongs to them. They feel that that land which was acquired and not used should return to them. But it has not been returned to them, and it has been given to slum dwellers who are destroying it, kind of arrangement. So this is going on. While this is going on, flooding continues, but there's local and international alliances sometimes between the states and other agencies, international agencies like the UN Habitat and so on, to try to deal with the problem. And then sometimes these same international institutions have been dealing also with the slum dwellers themselves, also to improve. But generally what you find is a brutal or apathetic city government at certain points of the time. So, some reflections from this discussion. The first is that flood vulnerability and responses have co-evolved with informal urbanization and not necessarily from changes in geophysical characteristics like changes in rainfall and so on, but rather as the city grows, flood vulnerability changes in various forms and so on. But it is important to understand 4 major factors, or let's say 3 major factors, whilst these processes are going on. The first is that, as I mentioned, the state has a critical role to play, and it plays it either by showing up or recoiling. Whilst the state is doing that, it has resulted in slum dwellers learning and understanding their conditions, and therefore trying to live every day within the floods. It's not adaptation, it is not resilience. I want to call it response, just response. Response as and when flood occurs. And these responses are clearly learned from previous experiences of flooding. So we have learned that. And then slum dwellers are seeing survival as a process. So they live processually through their flood events year in, year out. Given these reflections, what then can we say to policy? These are my views about how we can think about policy. They are not policy themselves, but where we can enter from. So I'm looking at rethinking informal urbanization and vulnerability to floods in cities in the developing world, where it is no more going to be distribution of relief items and or forced eviction, but rather beginning to understand that in most of these cities, land is a major issue. It belongs to several people, and therefore, anybody wanting to plan such areas should understand this myriad and complex actors and processes involved in understanding informal urbanization and so on. And then the community capacities to manage their floods. For 2 decades, people of Agbogbloshie and Old Fadama have lived there and have tried to engage state authorities, sometimes violently, sometimes with silence and so on. They have some amount of self-organizational capacities, which is not being used for now. And then the changing role of the state and city institutions in flood vulnerability management. Should it continue to be absence and presence, or something more should be done? And if there is, what then should be the role of the typical African state or African government in flood vulnerability management? Thank you very much.
Jeff?
Great. Thank you, Clifford. And thank you, Blair and Allison, Becca, IHC, World Bank, Cities Alliance. This is a great program here, and congratulations to everybody for, so far, some really great papers. I'm going to talk about, this is working, right? Okay. The Clifford's paper itself for a minute, and then I'm going to sort of widen the lens and talk a little bit about the implications of that for broader processes of urbanization globally, and then maybe a little bit about how USAID is approaching these issues. Can you speak up? Yes. So again, I'll talk about the paper itself, about the implications of this paper and presentation for sort of global processes of urbanization, and then a little bit maybe about USAID. And I may say Old Fadama, but I probably won't say the name of the other community, just so that you know. So that was a really great presentation and a great paper that really, I think, does a nice job of taking on a whole complex mix of issues and clearly framing the notion of vulnerability as something that's socio-politically determined as much as environmentally determined. And I like the way that it disentangles urban informality and urban vulnerability, which are two issues that are often conflated but don't necessarily, as he's made clear, that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. Informal communities don't need to be vulnerable simply by virtue of formality. And it's like it's the decisions that are made at various levels by authorities at various levels, the state, municipal, local authorities, and by local actors at individual or the collective level that either enhance or mitigate levels of exposure and sensitivity to hazards, or that impact a community's adaptive capacity to recover from shocks and stresses. And so the policy issues are all important. Slum dwellers need to be empowered as agents and participants in managing flood risk and other vulnerabilities, and it's important for communities to be working with state and local authorities to determine how they can access the services and infrastructures and authorities that they need to build resilience to disasters. And that's important in Accra. which has a population that has increased by 500,000 people in the last 15 years and will increase by another 1 million people in the next 15 years. So this is a really urgent issue that we need to figure out quickly. And it's not just a challenge for Accra, and that's where a lot of the lessons in this paper can come out for people who work on these issues throughout the developing world. So I'll go through some numbers which may be familiar to everybody, but they serve to make a point. Worldwide, the urban population will increase by over 1 billion people by 2030, and the vast majority of that increase will be in the developing world. And as urban areas absorb nearly all of the population growth over the coming years, they will also absorb a greater share of the risks associated with climate hazards. Over 600 million people and 13% of the world's urban population live in low elevation coastal zones. Those are zones that are less than 10 meters above sea level. And these are zones that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, risks of flooding, rising sea levels, intense storms, and storm surges. On average, least developed nations have nearly twice the proportion of their urban population in these zones compared to high-income nations. And in West Africa, 40% of the population lives in coastal cities. 13 of the most populous port cities are in countries with the largest populations living in extreme poverty. And these are the cities that are also poised to see some of the largest rises in urban population. Together, over 7.5 million people are exposed to coastal flooding. So within that population exposed to coastal flooding, it is the extreme poor who are living in high-density areas in these informal settlements, built without any regard to safety standards, with high concentrations of solid and liquid wastes and impermeable surfaces that accelerate stormwater runoff and disrupt natural drainage. And these are the people who are most at risk, most exposed to health risks and potential loss of livelihoods and life as a result of disaster. So what we're seeing globally is this confluence of rapid urbanization, extreme poverty, and vulnerability to natural hazards that will only become more of a challenge over the next 15 years and beyond. And because rural and urban areas are so interconnected, and as Clifford noted, most of the population growth in Old Fadama and the other one is a result of migration from rural communities. What happens in these cities will have an impact in rural areas. So one important mechanism to help end extreme poverty, which is the mission of USAID, other organizations, and which the global community this year is sort of galvanizing around as a prime goal to achieve by 2030, an important mechanism for helping to end extreme poverty will be to enhance the ability of urban institutions and residents to recover from urban shocks. At USAID, we talk about resilience as the ability of people, households, communities, countries, and systems to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks and stresses in a manner that reduces chronic vulnerability and facilitates inclusive growth. So it's a long sentence, but it's supposed to encompass a lot of things. So it's not just about climate resilience, it's about mitigating conflict so that displacement does not drive people into poverty. It's about strengthening health systems so that catastrophic illness or health costs don't prevent people from rising out of poverty. It's about enhancing food security so that a single bad harvest doesn't put communities at risk. And the creation of a resilient urban system is not just about preparing for the next shock, that floods will continue to happen, but building a sustainable foundation for poverty reduction that, as Clifford's paper nicely implies, should be inclusive of all populations, provide mechanisms for building human capital and opportunities for participating in the political, social, economic spheres of urban life, and provides insurance against the risks of weather-related or other disasters. USAID has an urban policy which was released just over a year ago in 2013. And the policy addresses urban resilience in the context of sustainable service delivery. So a lot of that is about financial sustainability of service delivery mechanisms. But at the heart of the policy is really an attempt to recalibrate the relationship between urban governance and local and the urban poor. And it's about building inclusive and participatory governance systems that respond to the demands of citizens, that hold local governments accountable for providing services to all urban residents. And since the release of that policy, I think there has been an uptick in interest at USAID and I think within the donor community in guidance on urban issues and in urban and a greater attention to urban development challenges. So, for example, during his recent trip to India, the administrator of USAID announced a new commitment to support urban sanitation efforts in India. That's a big deal. The U.S. Global Development Lab, housed at USAID, has taken on urban water and sanitation as a real priority for finding innovative and scalable solutions. And there are a number of other examples of country strategies or projects that are really focused on attending to the issues that Clifford presented in this paper of getting urban communities, slum dwellers, and governments together to solve the issues and build urban resilience. And I think it's these examples of initiatives, approaches, and strategies that USAID and other donors are pursuing based on the kinds of evidence and research that we're hearing about today that we hope are going to get us closer to a world without extreme poverty, that we hope will be taken up globally, and that will ultimately unlock urbanization as a key to drive economic growth that strengthens resilience, that is inclusive, that provides people opportunities to rise above poverty. So that's what I'll say. Thank you. Thank you, Cliff.
Thank you. Any points of clarification before we move on? Okay. What was yours?
Thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much again for inviting me here today. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about a different perspective of the urban development challenge by looking at the capacity of the informal sector to absorb urban unemployed youth through self-employment. Urban unemployed youth are increasingly really vulnerable segment of the population which will need particular focus and help in accessing economic activities in the urban space. So I'm essentially using some new data from Ghana, and I'm arguing that there are several constraints to this absorption capacity, which will need to be handled and tackled through a more comprehensive approach that has been done so far. So first, a little roadmap to keep us, but probably mostly myself, on track. I'm going to motivate it a little bit more, and then I'll look at the case study context and the data methodology before I'll dig into the results. Looking first at more macro-level constraints, including potential market saturation, infrastructure concerns as well, and then I'll look at a more individual level constraints, including lack of formal education and lack of relevant work experience. Why this topic? Why now? Well, I guess it's still no secret that policymakers are still really worried about high levels of unemployment in urban areas, and this situation is due to two things. So on one hand, we have really successful education for all policies, which means that we have a lot of primary school leavers who leave primary school but who find it very difficult to access higher levels of education. And at the same time, we still have quite inadequate job creation even when economic growth is picking up. So in the past, it's been estimated that the informal micro-enterprise sector has absorbed all these new labor market entrants. And this in turn has made policymakers very optimistic that this will also be the case in the future. Yeah? Oh, sorry, of course, sorry. Yeah, so in the past, it's been estimated that this sector has really absorbed all these youth, but in the future, policymakers are still very optimistic, assuming this might also be the case. And this optimism has sort of resulted in technical and vocational education and training programs really taking the center stage as a means to facilitate the transition from unemployment to self-employment. However, this absorption capacity and the assumption this is still really a good source for urban employment does need to be questioned, which is why I'm asking, does the informal sector currently have the potential for absorbing urban unemployed youth, and what barriers potentially have to be overcome? A brief rationale for picking Ghana as a case study. The figures are quite telling. Employment growth is lagging behind, and currently 86% of total employment is informal. Youth unemployment is also 3 times higher than the overall national rate in the country, and youth unemployment is also twice as high in urban areas than in rural areas, which makes it particularly interesting for today. We also have a very conducive policy environment in Ghana to giving youth practical skills so they can move on and become entrepreneurs. TREAD forms an integral part of the education system, and policymakers show quite a lot of willingness to increase support in this area if needed. And then recently they've also created a government scheme, the National Apprenticeship Program, which essentially sponsors young people to get skills for 1 year coming out of primary school, working next to a master craftsperson in the traditional trades, so typically welding or carpentry, tailoring, those kind of trades. And then finally, I was really lucky to have great data. I had a data set on current urban informal enterprises from the World Bank, and then I also had data on current unemployed youth seeking to access this government scheme, which is part of an impact valuation from Innovations for Poverty Action. So I don't want to dwell too much on the data and methodology, but I do want to highlight some of the limitations in the sector because there's still a really long way to go when we're talking about good data in the informal sector. So it tends to generally be the case that small formal firms, data on small formal firms really act as a proxy for informal enterprises because informal enterprises tend to not like authorities and they tend to hide. And secondly, existing informal sector data is often weak and fragmented and in particular very industry specific. So you find data on like small neighborhoods in one urban area, in one trade, but that's sort of it. So both of my data sets do overcome this. The World Bank data is really great because it's got information from several urban areas in Ghana on several industries. And the IPA baseline data allows me to look at a profile of the current youth that are really seeking to enter the sector. So I decided, although this was kind of good data, I decided that I would back up the trends that I would find in the quantitative data with some more qualitative interviews to really make sure that what I found was adequate. So I also interviewed 2 groups of respondents. I interviewed some trade association leaders to understand what was going on the ground, what the constraints of self-employment on the ground, and then I also interviewed some government officials at a higher policy level involved with designing these skills programs. I did a number of comparisons with these data sets to get my results, so that's what I'm going to show you next. Firstly, I wanted to get a feel of the diversity and the absorption potential of the informal micro-enterprise sector at the moment. So in this table, I know it might be a bit small, but what you essentially see is the World Bank data broken down by level of activity, and then whether it's expanding or not expanding in column 1 and 2. And expanding here refers to whether in the past 3 years, the number of employees, machinery used, or space occupied have increased. And I want us to take 2 things away from this table. First of all, we see that there's about a third of the enterprises interviewed who said that they had been expanding in the past 3 years. But when we break it down into activity levels, we see that overall, most of these activities have a higher proportion of non-expanding enterprises than expanding enterprises. Secondly, I do also want to highlight that some of them are doing comparatively better. So if we look at telecommunications, for example, or auto mechanics, these seems to have slightly more expanding enterprises and non-expanding enterprises. And it doesn't look all bad either for manufacturing furniture or metal products. And these findings were quite consistent with what in my interviews were mentioning. So for example, for the clothing sector there, that we see it's overall not expanding. The trade association representatives did say, well, you know, they're having a really hard time because there's lots of, they're facing competition from imported textiles and goods from China and India. Whereas when I spoke to carpenters or metal product producers, they were mentioning that they felt they were doing quite a lot better in their urban enterprises because they could form linkages with formal companies in Ghana, where construction is really, really on the rise. So although this does give a quite limited picture of what may be the absorption capacity of the informal sector, and definitely a very diverse picture, there could of course be a lot of other things constraining the growth of the sector. So I decided to also look at what enterprise owners had mentioned as constraints, and unsurprisingly, the most reported constraints were limited access to finance, electricity supply, and also limited access to land. These tends to be the ones that are most mentioned even for formal enterprises across sub-Saharan Africa. They're very much the same for both expanding and non-expanding owners, although electricity may be a bit more important for expanding ones, probably because they really need to give reliable services and reliable products. Interestingly, the lack of skills, or basically the least reported constraints of all the possible ones, but that was not very consistent with what I find in my interviews, because they were all mentioning, oh, formal education is really important to set up a successful enterprise. So I decided to have a look at what current enterprise owners have as education. So this table is again the World Bank data, but now looking at young enterprise owners and their level of education. And I restricted the sample to look at only young people, young owners, because this is basically the group that urban unemployed youth are seeking to join. And what we do see here, in fact, is that expanding enterprise owners do have significantly more formal education, about 1 year. And this difference is largely driven by a large proportion of non-expanding enterprise owners having no education at all, and expanding business owners having more secondary education. What's also interesting to note about this, however, is that vocational and technical training does matter a lot. So a high proportion of expanding owners do have this sort of training, and it's a very high proportion as well. Again, this was consistent with my interviews. They did mention that formal education is important both to sort of learn along the practical skills to understand and absorb them, but also later on to keep track of revenues and be able to apply for business loans. So to really hit home, education was mentioned as the main constraint, but it often came along with having relevant work experience. So I also had a little look at that, again with expanding and non-expanding young enterprise owners. And again, quite unsurprisingly, when you look at the occupation prior to the enterprise startup, you have a higher proportion of expanding business owners having been employed in the same activity as a current enterprise. Whereas you have a higher proportion, this trend is basically reversed for non-expanding business owners, where they have been employed in a different activity to their current enterprise. However, there's quite a lot of optimism from this table as well. We have a whole 27.5% of expanding business owners having established themselves straight from unemployment. So this should give us some more confidence about the sector being able to absorb young people in the urban space. So to hit home the point again about education, I decided to do one more comparison and look at all the young enterprise owners, irrespective of whether they're expanding or not, from the World Bank data, which is in column 1, and compare it with the profile of current unemployed people seeking to become part of this government program. There are a number of weaknesses with this kind of thing. I can gladly talk about them more if you want to hear about them, but I basically did this just to get a feel again for the profiles, because if the profiles are matching or they're quite similar, we would be more confident that young people in the urban space would be able to set up this kind of small enterprise. But yeah, quite unsurprisingly, young applicants do have less formal education, about a year less than current young owners. And this difference is again driven by a high proportion of all young owners having secondary education. And secondly, also, still vocational technical training is really important. More than a fourth of current enterprise owners have this. So it's definitely very necessary, but whether it's enough for a young person to establish themselves in the urban space, that's what's not very clear. Right, so what are we taking away from all these tables? Overall, there are at least 2 reasons to revisit the assumption that this sort of micro enterprise sector and the informal sector will continue to absorb these unemployed youth. Firstly, there seems to be some constraints to the absorption capacity on the ground. We do see that the constraints are the classic ones, so lacking infrastructure, access to finance, and these things. But it does go beyond this to assume that some sectors are facing market saturation. And then at a more individual level, there are also barriers for the sector to absorb unemployed youth. In particular, current unemployed youth may not have enough formal education, and if this is accompanied by insufficient relevant work experience, well, then it's not very realistic that these youth are going to go out and immediately set up their own enterprise. What do we do about this at a policy level? That is the million-dollar question. It's sort of clear that if this sector needs to still pull out all these unemployed youth and pull them in and give them some jobs, the sector will overall need to expand. And part of the solution is definitely to increase the electricity grids, help them access loans, but they may need to also consider more macroeconomic trade policies, for example, because there are some competitive pressures felt in the informal sector as well. And it may also be very relevant to look at the linkages that the informal enterprises can have to formal companies in order to pull everything together. And on the skill side of things, well, government schemes, although they're doing, in Ghana, they're doing a good job at focusing on practical skills, they might need to be complemented by some formal education programs. This can be done on a flexible basis, but we do need to have some more focus on basic numeracy and literacy skills because primary school leavers may not simply have enough of this. And also the government might need to seriously consider giving young people longer placements after they've done the practical skills, because it would be unrealistic to send young people off and be like, okay, you go and set up your own enterprise now. So although the urban unemployment challenge is, of course, very different in different countries, and so is the absorption potential in the informal sector, I do find quite strong case that giving practical skills is just one facet of the problem to having urban youth accessing self-employment. And we're going to need to have a more comprehensive approach looking at both macro and micro constraints if this needs to be the case. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great, Sina. Thank you to everyone, to the Wilson Center, USAID, IHC Cities Alliance, and the World Bank. And congratulations to Clifford and to Eric. This was very good presentations this afternoon. So my name is Jacob Reisner. I'm from the International Youth Foundation. What I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about IYF, just so you have a sense of who we are, what we do. Then some comments and some thoughts and reflections on Sina's great work in Ghana and her study. And then some reflections on some takeaways for practitioners in sort of youth development, in urban youth development that I saw from your work. So just a little bit about IYF. We are a Baltimore-based NGO that really invests in the power of young people. We envision a world where youth can really achieve their full potential and can really shape their own future with power and with confidence. And we do that in 3 thematic areas: in education, in workforce development and entrepreneurship, which is very relevant to your work, and also in civic engagement. And life skills is also a very important theme, a cross-cutting theme for what we do, and it's really important to teach the life skills to youth, both in formal setting and informal settings. And a lot of our work that focuses on entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, is comprehensive skills building. So teaching them not only technical skills, but also soft skills, budget skills, linking them with peers and with established business owners, as well as linking to finance, and really trying to create a supportive network. And then doing job placement support for those youth that at the end of the training program realize that they're not really ready to take that jump yet into entrepreneurship. So some comments about Sina's study. We know that throughout many countries in the world, in Africa and beyond, there's this huge youth bulge, and where the populations are very youthful, and not only larger than sort of the older populations, but just the largest they've ever seen in their countries. And so a lot of times we see these youth populations as either challenges and problems that we need to fix, or as opportunities. And I think all of us would like to see them as opportunities, and really to have these youth be agents of change in their communities, both economically and socially. And so we really want to focus on helping them to make that transition from childhood into adulthood, into the workforce, not only for them to become successful, but also for their families and their communities and larger and throughout their nation. And so with these large youth populations, we have a huge challenge with workforce development. A lot of times there just isn't, with the formal employment sector, there's just not the absorptive capacity for youth to get jobs. And so a lot of times, a lot of what IYF does is help youth create their own economic opportunities to start their own businesses. And a lot of times we encourage them to go into these informal micro enterprises because ostensibly, there's less barriers. There are fewer barriers. It's not as difficult to start up. It's as for informal versus and also the large-scale enterprise versus micro-scale enterprise. However, there are very real and often insurmountable challenges that youth face starting a business, no matter the size, no matter the dimension, which you brought up in your research, and I think is really important for us to think about as we support youth to start their own businesses. Sina's research did a really good job providing evidence that the IME sector can't adequately absorb all youth business owners who want to sort of enter it. We can often assume that this sector is sort of a catch-all for anyone that we can't find a job because they might not have the formal secondary education. They can't start their own formal sector business, so let's just get a tea stall going on the side of the road and get you some economic opportunities to start a career, and then we'll sort of work from there. And I think there is a role for these type of opportunities, and they can be a stepping stone. However, your research really is making us take a critical look at these assumptions and seeing whether, what is the role that the informal microenterprise sector can and should play in development. It's really good that you brought to light both micro and macro level issues that entrepreneurs face. You had a quote from one of your interviews that I thought was really a great illustration of both. You were interviewing someone and they said, choked markets are a real issue where duplication, not innovation, is taking place. And so if you think about if you're a new business owner and you're going into the market and your shop is the same as everyone else's and there's 20 shops, you have some of these larger constraints and getting access to a shop and all of that. But if all the shops look alike and you don't have the education or the experience to know how to innovate and be creative to make your shop, have that edge, then those micro level constraints are also coming out in there. So I thought that was a really indicative quote that you had. And so both micro and macro level issues are important and really require tailored interventions. And what IYF focuses mostly on is the micro level interventions. We really focus on getting youth the education that they need and the experience that they need. Making sure that, so we work with training providers, with schools, with NGOs that provide skills to these youth, but making sure that it's comprehensive, that it's market relevant. A lot of what we've seen in the TVET sector is that the training that the youth are getting are 20 years outdated on equipment that hasn't been used in the sector for a decade. And so if they gain these skills in the vocational schools, they can't really be competitive, one, in the job market, but then also trying to start their own business and trying to be competitive that way. Also, a lot of these training providers don't provide remedial education. So they don't have remedial numeracy or literacy, which is a key barrier that a lot of our youth have. And then the soft skills, so teaching them how to work with others, goal setting, time management, which are also just as important as how to create something to sell. If you don't know how to manage your time well, then that's a key barrier as well. And so making sure that the education is very holistic and that there is a linkage with the private sector. That, I think, is very important. And that there's career guidance and job placement. So sometimes youth, they become entrepreneurs out of necessity and not because they want to. So helping them to see what is the long-term approach, their long-term career trajectory, and how can this first step help them along the way. So also, one thing that was really interesting about your research, Sina, was it's not only about the inability for the IME sector to absorb new entrants, but it's for the need to strengthen and support both the TVET and the formal secondary education systems. So it's not just a workforce development issue, it's also an education issue. And I think that's really important because there needs to be a strong link between the two. We can't just have schools, what we've seen a lot is, or I've seen in my own experiences, schools will focus more on getting youth through the system, getting them to graduate, but then once they graduate, there's no connection with the employability or entrepreneurship. And so then youth are sort of at this lurch, and you need to be able to make that connection. And it's not just about academics, but it's about career preparation, and you really need to be able to do that. So some takeaways for practitioners in the field that I think are really important from Sina's research is we need to really evaluate the absorptive capacity of the IME sector where our programs are running, to do really robust labor market assessments as we tailor our programs to make sure that we're tracking youth into the right sectors and making sure that we're not setting them up for failure. We also need to reevaluate the education and the training that we provide youth. In regards to formal education, having wider access to secondary education, and making sure that we teach innovation and creativity in there, because we really need to teach those skills, and if we want them to be, it's not only just for entrepreneurship, but also broader in life. With TVET systems, we have a lot that I think we can learn from your research, making sure that there's job placement, that there's access and linkages to the private sector. A lot of what the private sector can do is help trainings be market relevant and sort of supporting the TVET providers to build their infrastructure and to make sure their curricula are market relevant. Because the incentive for the private sector is then you now have a workforce that is sort of, meets all of your needs. And job placement is really important as well. And I think the last thing is that we need to make sure we always incorporate resiliency into our youth development programmings, because as much as we can do to build the secondary education system or the TVET system or analyze the absorptive capacity of any sector, youth need to have resiliency in order to succeed, because we can set them up for success, but there will always be these external factors that they need to be able to navigate along the way. So resiliency is really strong. So yeah, it was a great study, and I really enjoyed reading it.
Well, I want to thank the panelists. Let me begin by asking if there are points of clarification for the last paper. Okay, I think now we're going to begin to move to a general discussion, and we have a comfortable amount of time for a general discussion. And I wanted to lead off. I'm struck by the fact that all three papers are talking about the discontinuous nature of urban development. Eric spoke about the episodic engagement of external international actors. Clifford spoke about the alternating presence and absence of the state. Sina really questioned the continuous absorptive capacity of the informal sector. And what begins to emerge is a notion that cities and communities grow in fits and starts. And this shouldn't surprise us. I just happened to be reading a history of New York, and the author talks about a recurring cycle of about a decade and a half of growth followed by stagnation throughout the history of New York City. But there's a predictability in that cycle. He kind of is suggesting that he understands how long it is, and yet we're talking about discontinuities here which are not necessarily, which occur in a perhaps unpredictable way, or it would take a different kind of algorithm to define the predictability. So we have this reality on the ground, and what we see is that discontinuity is, in resilient communities, is being seized upon by community institutions which fill the gap and respond in different ways, and we see it in all three papers. Yet when we come back here to a place like Washington, where we're within 10 miles of hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are trying to think about how to create a sustainable and inclusive foundation for reducing poverty worldwide, we don't have a way of talking about these discontinuities. we tend to see growth, if cyclical, at least somewhat predictably so. We tend to talk about linear outcomes. Accra has grown 500,000 people in the past 15 years. It's going to grow 1 million people in the next 20 years. That's how we conceptualize the problem we're trying to confront. And yet each of the papers describes a very different kind of reality. So I'd like to ask the paper givers to comment a little bit on how their understanding of discontinuity really forces a reconsideration of development paradigms. And part of what everybody has said, it's a clear takeaway, is that we need holistic, comprehensive approaches which encompass a wide range of factors. But it also seems to me that you're each in different ways highlighting an uncomfortable overlay of conceptualization of urban development, which tends to see a continuity and a reality which, in the cases you point to, is very starkly episodic. And so what are the lessons for the people in this room that you would draw from the ways in which your work highlights the episodic nature of urban development?
Right, I will start. Yes, this is how I see it. For a very long time, you can see that most African cities have received a lot of support from donor agencies towards urban development. One can talk of, but what we can mainly remember is that of what they call the Land Administration Project, sponsored by the World Bank. That's a case in point we can talk about. When you read the evaluation reports, and you have not been to Africa, you think it's a success. That's what you think. But it has not been entirely a successful project. And the reason is what we're talking about. The reason is that some of these policies have failed to understand the complexities of, for example, land administration, land ownership, and so on, have failed to understand the historical development of some of these cities. Again, the main idea behind the project is to turn these cities into globalized cities, i.e., to turn, for example, an Accra to maybe some of the globalized cities I don't want to mention, but so to turn a messed city to a picture that we have in our mind. And that, I think, is where the problem has always been. Our approach to change a world, or let's say a third world city, into a first world city. I don't think we can go with that. So I think that our entry point should be understanding the cities as what they are and planning them or intervening within what they are. Another question that we can ask is, so how do we do that? Good. From where I said, how we can do that should be to understand the kind of institutional arrangements that exist in these cities. Most donor projects appear to deal with only the city-state or the identifiable institutions. So you find that in most of the donor-funded reports, what you find is that there are proposals such as to formalize the urban land management process, to sort of restructure, words like that are used, restructure the urban land management process, to mainstream, words like that are used. What it means basically is to formalize what is informal.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where the difficulty is. That is where the difficulty is. So I think that we can start from the African perspective by understanding the informality rather than formalizing informality. That's where I come from.
Eric, do you have anything you want to add?
Sure, just to build off of Clifford's comments. I think this issue of discontinuity is really interesting. And I think it's really interesting to ask where these discontinuities come from. At least in the Indian context, it's kind of inbuilt into the system. It's kind of a accountability, checks and balance, where discontinuities, for example, I can see a couple ways that discontinuity comes from in the bureaucratic sphere and public sector bureaucracies. Obviously, there's electoral cycles, but also in India, there's the civil service system where people come and go according to political leadership. So in terms of policy direction, discontinuity is built in to prevent corruption and nepotism. Another way that discontinuities can come in is through finance. For example, India is very famous for their national schemes. There's so many of them that are kind of short duration, between 5 and 10 years, that kind of accompany the 5-year plans that India does every 5 years. And a good example, a recent one, is the National Urban Renewal Mission, where it was one of the largest intergovernmental transfer mechanisms for urban development and governance reform, I think in the world maybe. And it really was a lot of money that came through over a 5-6 year cycle to support governance reform, conditional governance reform that's linked to infrastructure improvement money. So it's episodic in a sense that intergovernmental transfers are episodic in that sense. The other way is obviously that what Clifford was talking about is spatial episodes, not just in terms of movements of migration, but also in terms of discontinuities in how space is managed in cities. In the Indian context, cities have urban development is managed by 2 distinct institutional bodies a lot of times. One is the municipal corporation. A lot of cities, most cities have that, which is the policy organ, political organ that manages the day-to-day. The other is the development authority, the urban development authority, which is the spatial planning authority. So there's discontinuities there. So there's a lot of different explanations, and I think a really good question to ask is, where do these discontinuities come from, and how do external actors either engage those discontinuities and just work with that and try to improve the ability of governance systems to deal and adapt to discontinuities and episodes of finance and development and migration and all this stuff? Or do we support an alternative model of external support where we're really advocating for something that's less, well, more continuous? And I think the Indian system is, in a way, perfectly adapted to this discontinuity. I mean, there's a lot of pros and cons, and local governance in India is maybe not the best example to upscale to different countries, but you do see innovations in the sense that, yes, there's discontinuities, but you also see public sector institutions reaching out to different actors. You see public sector institutions really very recently, especially in the new administration, the Modi government, a real strong focus on public-private partnerships to fill in some of these institutional gaps and governance deficits. There's a real strong focus, at least in the cities that I look at, of civil society mobilization, strengthening NGOs, and trying to fill public service and infrastructure gaps. In a sense, for example, some informal settlements are formed in a way that have no access to pipe water or electricity, and you start to see NGOs coming in and filling those gaps. And the success rate depends, but you start to see alternative mechanisms of dealing with discontinuities that is kind of just an inbuilt structural deficit that local governments have to contend with. And I think India is maybe a good case to understand the dynamics and the intricate kind of tools and schemes and that come into play. Yeah.
Sina?
Right, yeah, no, that's been touched on a lot of really good points. I guess I would just add from the microenterprise perspective here is that, well, the informal
And
sector.
speak into the microphone.
Sorry. But at the informal sector, at enterprise level, the informal sector is really looked a bit like as a second best option to having jobs in the formal sector. And part of these discontinuities in the informal sector as well, you know, like Clifford was saying before, you know, it just happens. Like, it wasn't like it was planned for, that the informal sector would be able to absorb all these urban youth. Yeah, I guess it is happening whether you want it or not, and that's a bit where the discontinuity is happening. Is that if you don't start really being in it, it's difficult to do something about it. And although, you know, great work is being done trying to fit some of those discontinuities, it may be necessary to also look at it at a government level in order to sort of supervise and fill the gaps a bit more.
Why don't we open up? We've had some very rich presentations. We have a question right over here. We'll get you a microphone. It's coming around.
Hello, my name is Steve Senna. I'm with the World Computer Exchange, and great presentations all and great comments. I had a question, I guess, for, is it Sina and Clifford? So I'm actually involved in a project that works on the intersection of electronic waste, e-waste, and youth capacity building and skills development. So I'm curious, was that one of your sectors, given the prevalence of e-waste in Ghana? One of your sectors, yeah. Thank you.
I might start. No, this is not at all something I encountered. But I mean, I also looked at it from a government level to begin with, and the government is very much settled on these ideas of the traditional trades. So all the tailoring and the hairdressing and all these things that you really see duplicated. Like, they haven't thought much about innovating the areas for skills, for practical skills training. They're very much thinking in the old areas of entrepreneurship. So I didn't. Maybe you did, Clifford.
Okay, right. I will say this. The e-waste sector, as you said, is very, very important, but it's not structured, as in there isn't any policy that deals with that. It has to do more with kind of a family business. So, for example, if a dad is dealing with refrigerators, used refrigerators, he automatically will train his children to do it. So they learn to do it on the job. And you can find very, very small children, people even around 6 years of age, are all doing this kind of job, and this is quite hazardous to their health. So I would say that there are 3 policies we should have addressed that. The first is the youth policy, but it has always remained in a draft. Anytime you talk to any government, I say, is there any youth policy in Ghana? They will say, well, we have a draft, and we have never been able to see the draft. Then there is an educational policy. It says nothing about these kinds of development. Doesn't say anything about entrepreneurship among children or among the youth and so on. I've talked about youth, I've talked about education. Then there should be an employment or a policy on employment. That has also been in the draft for God knows when. So clearly, there isn't anything addressing that, which makes it informal, something going on at the blind side of government. That's what it is.
Okay, next one, in the back, yes?
Yeah, hi, Jennifer Reamer from SAIS. Very interesting presentations, and sorry to come in late, conference call. I'm very interested in this issue of whether or not informal employment is to some extent a commons problem or suffers. I think it does. And what this says to me is that we need to put more attention on why there are not more formal jobs, which is a whole series of policy failures. But that seems to be, it's almost like blaming the victim. Well, you guys are unemployed, we're going to give you some skills to get a job, which in fact we know there's not really going to be, you're just going to take part of the income from everyone else who's already there. And do you see any, I mean, how do we get around that? The government jobs are not going to be there, we all know that. But really addressing the constraints to why businesses don't go from small to mid-size in particular, so that they create more jobs, seems to me to be essential, and I don't really see that happening.
Sina, and if you want to jump in, Jacob. Sina, go ahead.
No, thank you so much for raising that point. I think that's a really, I think that's the right comment and the right point to make. In Ghana, at least, I mean, it comes down a lot to secondary education just simply not being available at the moment. It's like in Ghana and many other countries, these education for all policies have really thought about a lot about the primary education level, but they haven't thought more about what do we do with these people once they have a primary education? They're going to ask for more. They're going to have expectations about what's going to happen. And most of these youth, when you actually talk to them, they don't want to do informal apprenticeships, and they don't really want to go on the roadside selling things. They want more education and eventually go to university. And how to deal with that? I mean, that's a problem within the government at the moment. Rumor has it that there are some drafts in the Ghanaian government about making better secondary education available, and there's definitely funding streaming into the country. But yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with what you're saying about, you know, who we're sort of blaming for these issues, and I think a lot of it just goes back to equipping and enhancing the education that we have, and the secondary education and the TVET systems, and making sure that they're market relevant and that they have good, strong linkages to the private sector, so that as the private sector hopefully increases and matures, that it can work in closely with the training providers, so there's a good linkage between the two.
Okay. Right here, and then we'll come up in front. Yes, right there.
Hi, Laurel Starkey from Bravo in Arlington. Just a quick question. Are there systemic distortions which cause firms not to grow? I mean, just following up on her question. Because it seems like what you're implying is that you can continue to educate people, but there won't be jobs for them, which is sort of increasing an expectation, which will lead to more disequilibrium.
Yeah, do you want to answer that one?
I don't know, I think that's a really good question. I think a lot of it is teaching expectations and helping them, the youth, about goal setting and understanding sort of career trajectories, because I think a lot of it is that youth have these unrealistic expectations about what they can do for the first job that they have, and then they fail, and then they never go anywhere else. And so it's helping them to see that failure is part of the process, and helping them to see that you have to start in manageable steps. So I think that's from like sort of the intrinsic side of helping them to be able to succeed more.
And I would just add to that, like you said before, innovation is really key, and there's lots of youth who don't. Again, when you speak to them on the streets, they're saying, oh, you know, but my sister owns a tailor shop. I'm going to set up one completely identical to hers. And you go like, well, maybe you should try and specialize. And that's where the work experience comes in. You know, if you got longer placements, you get more specialized in one area. So I wouldn't say that it's not because they won't succeed. It's just there are many more steps to it. And young people get very enthusiastic when they hear about, oh, I can have my own enterprise like my sister or like my aunt. But we probably need to adjust those a little bit.
Definitely.
Hiwat Gabramariam, EPA. Thank you for great presentations. Congratulations, I learned a lot. My question is on informal settlements and land rights issues. In a situation where a piece of land is claimed by multiple people, how does the state work with the community in that situation?
Yeah, thank you very much. That is exactly what happens in the situation I was discussing. This is one of the typical example of the discontinuity we're talking about. What happens in most African cities is that you have the planning authority getting, let's say, a map of the area and designing, sometimes without going there, designing. So when you go into the offices of the urban planning institutions, you have a design of, say, a particular neighborhood in the city. When they do that designs, they're just waiting for somebody to come and say, I have this paper from the chief or the traditional authority who sold the land to me, so you can now register for me. Yeah. Enormous power belongs to this man who can sell and sometimes do what they call multiple sales of land. Yeah, so that results in what you are describing. They don't have a solution for it. What they do is it's a highest bidder's game. So who has a lot more money or who is fast to develop gets the land. If we are lucky, the one who sold it for you or sold it to you earlier will give you another location which might not be the location you want. But that is how it is. It's a kind of a winner-takes-all game. And that's how it is actually.
Also, the space occupied by a family could be very small, not functional. And how is it possible to develop the whole area when the spaces are so scattered and there's no plan in the first place?
Yeah, informal settlements do not, that's what the argument has been, it's an emergence. It doesn't really have a shape. When you want to develop it and make it more functional, it is possible to do that. But as it stands now, most of these settlements are not planned, and like I was saying, it's an incremental building. So as and when the economic or socioeconomic situation of the family changes, they add. So you can see that maybe it was 1 room or 2 rooms 2 years ago. Today, or 3 years from now, you come and see 4 rooms. What it means is that maybe a son or a daughter traveled outside and is beginning to send money home for the house to change. Yeah. When they are lucky, they can even buy the next plot and send the poor people away. That is, so the poor person is always sent away. The city is always changing in shape and in size and in even structure. Yeah, that's how it is all the time.
Mentioning multiple sale of the same piece of land, I once wrote a story, study that included an examination of Osaka, and one day in 1905, half the Osaka city government was arrested for selling the same piece of land multiple times. So it's not just an African problem or a new problem. Yeah, right here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is David Bishop. I'm a teacher at American University. I and my colleague are doing research on a very specific topic on this, which is resilience and people with disabilities. Now that's complicated, but let me take a wider issue, which I find lacking. I've been to numbers of resilience conferences, and I find the papers, a number of them here, and they've been excellent. But I find, if I might say so, a lack of attention to the complexity of people. So this title, Inclusion, today was wonderful. This was something new, that finally we were looking at people, not just at systems and dams and floodwater heights and things of that kind. Just to make a dramatic point, the tragedy of Katrina was not that people suffered and died, but that poor black people suffered and died in such high proportions. And so it seems to me when we do these analyses, things like ethnicity and race and religion and caste and gender tends to get its attention quite often, to be honest, but these things aren't discussed. And I've yet to go to a conference where or presentations where I've heard them discussed, and it seems to me that in the informal sector there's going to be ethnic differences, who's getting these jobs and who isn't getting these jobs. There's going to be gender differences. It's possible in India that there's caste issues in these. And these issues don't seem to get a lot of coverage. And I'd just be interested to hear from the speakers if you've actually came across this, or if people are giving attention to these issues or not.
While you're thinking, just point out that the draft post-2015 UN Sustainable Development Goal number 11 on cities speaks to sustainability resilience, but inclusive is the first word in it. So it's not, I think we're entering into a new stage of discussion in which inclusion is going to be an important part of how we talk about these issues. And what's exciting about that particular draft, if it's adopted by the UN General Assembly, is that inclusion is very much part of the vision of how cities can become resilient and sustainable. But based on your field work, to what extent do issues of gender, ethnicity, enter into race, enter into the stories you're looking at?
Yeah, in my case, in fact, in the PhD, the thesis I'm writing, I have a section on that. Gender is an issue, and ethnicity is an issue. The Old Fadama, the second community I'm working with, is largely populated by second generation of northern Ghanaians, or Ghanaians from the northern part of the nation. Yeah, the story I was told is that in the 1994-95, there was a war or an ethnic conflict in the north. And as part of the Interior Ministry's intervention in the war, they took the displaced people from that place to that area I'm talking about. So, and that was 94. So over the years, some people have grown and lived there as a result of the displacement from the ethnic conflict. So that is one. Secondly, there were a number of women I interviewed who are running away from early marriages. Yeah, forced early marriages. And as the question I asked them was, why do you still continue to live here and get flooded every year? And the answers were included running away from early marriages and getting good opportunities to send things back home in the north. So it showed up, but we are not able to talk about it for the same purpose. That is, either it can be looked at as inclusion or segregation, depending on who is looking at it. So sometimes you find people saying, I did a work earlier back in Ghana, and during the presentation, when I was looking at ethnicity and said nordness, I used the word nordness for a proportion. It generated a lot of heat at the presentation. That what do I mean when I say nordness? And it was, amongst us, it was quite a heated debate. So sometimes you want to be silent for the same reason, unless you want to make noise and say, well, it's inclusion. So some people have argued that the use of inclusion may only be for political reasons or political correctness, rather than it achieving the purpose that, or any purpose for that matter. That's the idea there, especially with ethnicity. It has generated that kind of argument that what are you segregating for? Is it important that you talk about nordness suffering, or you have to focus on people suffering in a hazardous region? Must they be nordness? Should you actually distinguish between a nordner and a non-nordner in your analysis of flooding? That's the question that has always been coming up, and that, to me, might be the reasons why we might keep quiet on some of these things.
Eric, Sina, anything to add?
Sure. I think on the issue of inclusiveness, it is going that way. It is changing, and there is a much more focus on, at this point, on representational inclusiveness in decision-making processes, so procedural justice issues. I think for just speaking on climate resilience, I think for many, many years, one, it's a disciplinary thing. The term resilience came from ecology, so by definition, it was kind of not super cognizant of social systems, but it got really into problem definition, trying to understand what it meant. So, and then came, oh, we're starting to see people being marginalized in the process. So let's consider representational inclusiveness. And I think where the conversation is going is in terms of distributional inclusiveness. We're starting to see a lot. It's been a couple years since a lot of these climate change, resilience, and adaptation projects have been implemented. And a lot of the initial first generation external actor kind of projects were cognizant of participatory mechanisms. And at least in India, a strong focus on gender, on caste, on class, on marginality in terms of where they live. And to some extent, those were represented, but in terms of what the outcome was, whether their interest represented in the implementation stages is more debatable. So naturally, the conversation has moved to, so what happens when adaptation and resilience projects end up displacing people at the back end? What happens if it actually increases the vulnerability of different sectors of society once those adaptation projects are implemented? So the conversation is changing that way in terms of looking at the distributional impacts and the injustices of first generation projects and outcomes. But yes, the focus, I think, overall has not been on inclusiveness, but it is, you do see changes, I think.
Yeah, if I can just add a point about gender and inclusion of gender, because when I interviewed the policymakers of this national apprenticeship program, they said they were very focused on striking a gender balance in order to include both men and women. So they picked these trades for women and tailoring and hairdressing, and trades for men, carpentry and welding. And what you saw in the applications that the program received, there were a lot more women applying than men. And they all came this preconception when you speak to them that, oh, but we can only really make it in tailor or hairdressing because we can't do the other things. And I think what you end up doing is then, well, supposedly it's supposed to be inclusive for women as well, but they get sort of pressured into a segment where they only think they can go into that. And as a result, they don't become as innovative as they probably should be.
Okay, I'm about to give a final word to Bob Dubinsky, but let me see if there are any other questions. Very quick, if it's very quick.
I think another discontinuity is in looking at informal areas only as a place of residence and not as a place of business. But in fact, a lot of businesses are there and they face somewhat more difficult circumstances. So I just want to put out a plea for inclusion of the business perspective as well as the housing perspective.
Okay, I think, Bob, I'm going to give you a chance to wrap up. Bob is not only CEO of the International Housing Coalition, but a good longtime friend of this program and of the Wilson Center and many of the programs represented in the room.
Thanks very much, Blair. I thought this was a terrific session, and I thank both the presenters and the commenters on it. I really learned a lot out of this, and it really raised a lot of issues that I hadn't thought about, and the complexity of everything, and who would want to be a city manager or mayor having come to this event today. There's clearly a lot of very challenging things to deal with at the local level in these countries. Since I was involved in the start of this organization, I'd just like to give you a little historical information. As Blair mentioned, this is the 5th year for this competition, and I would like to recognize an aide employee, Jessica Rosen, who was really one of was really the stimulator of the whole idea of setting up this competition 5 years ago, with the idea being that urban wasn't really getting the attention that it deserved, that young people weren't getting interested in urban issues, and maybe this would be a way to attract people who are getting into the professions to get into urban issues and to adopt urban kinds of professional careers in their lives. And hopefully that's made a difference. I think it maybe has. I'm really sort of struck over the last 5 years about how urban has become much more significant than I remember it was 5 years ago. And when you started to talk about urban, it was hard to get anybody's attention. But now I think it really is on everybody's agenda. I think political leaders and the donors and country leaders have finally come to recognize that people are moving to cities and they're going to stay there, and something has to be done about that. And I think the fact that, as Blair mentioned, we now are going to probably have an sustainable urban development goal as part of the next development agenda for the next 15 years is really quite significant. And I think it's going to make a huge difference in terms of the priorities that donors are going to give and the priorities that country leaders are going to give to dealing with urban problems. I mean, urban problems are very big, very challenging, and require a lot more money and attention than they have in the past. So I guess I come out of hearing you all talk a little humbled by all the complexity of it all, but also very encouraged by the idea that urban is getting more attention and that there's more resources that are being given to urban. I think the fact that all three of the presenters talked a lot about the informal sector, and a lot of the questions about the informal sector I think were excellent. I mean, the informal sector is not there because it wants to be there. It's there because of the absence of resources and the absence of recognition that people are moving to cities. They need a place to live, they need a job, they need education. They've told the stories about the fact that, you know, if you go and look at maps of a few years ago, all these informal settlements were never on maps because they didn't exist. You weren't going to provide services to them. The people weren't citizens. They didn't have the right to vote in the localities. I think people are now beginning to realize that addressing the issues of the informal sector are really critical to the future of economic growth and development. So I thank you all. I'm more optimistic than I was 5 years ago, and I'm more optimistic than when I walked in this afternoon.
Thank you, Bob. I hope you will grab a copy of the book Heading Out. Previous books are available on our website. I want to thank the winners and congratulate them not only on winning, but as Bob just said, it's really heartening to see your interest in urban challenges. I want to thank the commentators for taking time out of their busy schedules. And I want to thank all of you for making it here. Presumably it's still raining outside, but maybe it hasn't turned to ice yet. So thank you very much.
Maybe there's 2 feet of snow.
Maybe there's 2 feet of snow.